Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast. Today we're going to talk about a few things. I think we're going to get into the knowledge management of publishing, the history of knowledge management and publishing, particularly when you got into Fortune magazine when you were at NEA and they didn't have the best knowledge management. But we can also go into RDBS from Oracle and how it
MS,
what
ABMS,
RDMS
RDB.
from Oracle and how it applies to vectorized databases, which is what I'm currently working on. So where do you want to start? Should we go into history?
We want to start. It's very short to talk about knowledge management and publishing companies because there is none. Still really isn't any. And I can talk about both Fortune and the Washington Post company. But I mean, it's true for all of the legacy publishing companies that if you had one publication, your knowledge management system was in your head, the editor's head or the collection of editors or whatever it was, because they edited all the articles and that was what they knew. That there were no computers at the time. In fact, I just read a really interesting, I'll have to send it to you, but the editor of Vanity Fair also became the editor of the New Yorker for 6 years, Tina Brown, and she has a Substack called From Hell or something like that. And I can go look it up while I'm talking to you, but she talked about her 6 years in
I'll find it.
At the New Yorker, and then she turned it over when she left to
Fresh Hell.
Yeah, Fresh Hell, that's it. So the last one she did was a kind of retrospective of her 6 years at the New Yorker, and then the guy who's still running it today, almost 20 years later, it's the 50th anniversary of the New Yorker, and is David Rebnick, and he took over from her. So she had this little, and she was hired to change it because all the New Yorker was like this fuddy-duddy old publication. So that article about the New Yorker for those 6 years is all the history you're ever going to get because somebody had to write about it to learn about it because it was before the internet. So publishing companies. So when you get to companies that have more than one publication, like Time Inc., which published Sports Illustrated, People, Fortune, Time magazine itself, they had like 20 publications. Every publication was run as a silo where the editors and the ad people, all of them operated separately, and it was a very thin layer on top. And so there was no corporate knowledge of each publication. When the internet happened, this really challenged publishing companies. And I experienced at Infowom, and that's our chapter 7 is that's why I was thinking about it when I went back and read it. Because I was the editor of Infowom, and I knew everything that was going on in Infowom. And so when we learned about the internet and I got the Mosaic browser and I'm going like, oh my God, the same thing was happening at every other of the 200 publications at IDG overseas and in the US. And IDG was an incredibly distributed organization. So it never tried to centralize the response to the internet. Every publication dealt with it on its own. And a lot of them did end up going out of business. But at Time Inc., they tried to centralize it so that the Fortune people would have to put their stuff in Pathfinder, I think is what they called it. And the editors were like, NFW, I'm not doing that. I'm not giving my stuff to something else inside the company that's going to make money off of it.
Ooh.
And we're going to go out of business. It's like it was a total threat inside the company. And this was true everywhere.
Well,
and the reason I mentioned the Washington Post is that they had an IT guy, CTO, at the Washington Post. This is about the same vintage, who, no, a little bit later, who figured out that Washington Post owned Newsweek and TV stations, and there was a bunch of different operations inside the company. But the Washington Post was the parent company. And he figured out that there was no way that you could implement IT centralized and
Hmm.
have everybody else protected. And so he came up with a schema for the architecture of IT in the Washington Post that presumed that each entity operated independently and had to have its own firewall, not a universal firewall. And that by doing that, you could make the content in each operation secure, and you could manage it centrally. So it's like it was brilliant. Guy is a venture capitalist now. And,
Wait, what
um,
was his name again? Can you repeat his name?
uh, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head.
What was his
I know
role? What was his role
he was the chief IT guy at the Washington Post.
at IT? Oh, wait, I might know him. Was it the Indian guy?
Yeah,
No, later. Oh, okay. Yeah, Yuri, UV Kochar.
you have a Kochar. I think that's right.
Yeah. I'm going to make a note to go reach out to him. That sounds like an interesting interview to bring him on. Uh, um, so this is interesting because it also applies to AI today. We had somebody
Actually,
from,
he was not. He's the more recent.
yeah, okay.
Before you do that, let me figure it out.
Yeah.
But I think he inherited the organization.
And so this is also applicable to AI. At AI Whispers last Thursday, we had somebody from Google who was at Google when they tried to release Bard. And Google is going through, I imagine, a crazy thing, as is Apple, as is Meta, as is all of them, where there are all these little silos. There is the cloud that's sort of centralized, right? But they're trying to implement AI into all of their different things. First of all, they don't know how to do it because maybe 0.1% of the population of these companies actually know what AI does, and it's not the thing that everybody else is thinking that it does. And then how do you merge the ship, like steer this giant ship where people don't understand it, let alone sell their customers on it? What do you think about that?
Uh, that's a fair analogy, right? The arrival of the internet challenged the organization of companies, because you have to resolve issues universally inside the company. The
Mm.
companies weren't organized that way at all. I mean, even the most top-down organizations were still weren't able to manage that in the IT sense. So for AI, um, in fact, that's probably what makes Microsoft different is that they do have control over their thinking about technology and they're
Oh,
sophisticated, understand the technology, which is what's led Microsoft to be much more conservative about CapEx and even its original deal with OpenAI. Um, but
okay.
and so they're all dealing with it differently. OpenAI is a new organization, so they're just dealing with the fact that they're growing so fast and, you know, everybody's disagreement about their mission. Um, Whereas Google is an existing company which has been highly distributed and is terrible at product management. So if you view AI as a product like Gemini, um, they've been really, really slow to productize it and to get everybody on board with that. They're kind of there now, which is
Yeah.
interesting. They sort of
So
have, and then you
particularly with
look
the
at Apple.
API, particularly with the API. So now I'm using Google's API for all of my applications because there's a 1 million token context window for the API, meaning which the only other large one is Claude, and Claude is pretty good. But why, like, a million tokens versus 100,000 tokens versus whatever OpenAI has, like, why would I use anything else? And they've released a whole suite of different things. It's really hard to navigate their website because they're this old legacy company that, with the feature creep, as we've discussed. Um, there's the question of how did Microsoft build that into their culture early? I have some ideas about how they might have done that, but how did that work, and how is it juxtaposed against the creativity of Apple? Because Apple had this creativity. I just watched this great video of Steve Jobs of saying that all of Microsoft's products are pedestrian, that they have no taste, which is right. But also they're this juggernaut that is able to ride the waves of the pure technology, whereas Apple was able to instill European Enlightenment aesthetics into their product, which was really beautiful. And I like that. But then Microsoft has this technology. That was a very large question, but what do you think about all that?
That doesn't include everything, but before the iPhone, Apple was never really that successful, right? The creative industries, advertising and graphic design, stuff like that, hurt the Macintosh. So the Mac had a market, but it was a fairly small market relative to Windows. And so it wasn't until the iPhone showed up and they beat everybody in the market with the right configuration that they became dominant in a particular marketplace. The same thing that led Microsoft to be so powerful is what led Apple to be powerful once the iPhone came out, which is catch the wave. They have to catch the wave. And Microsoft caught the wave with MS-DOS because of IBM's endorsement, and they rode on that. And they were really smart about adding to that, right? They then did Windows, took them like multiple versions to figure it out. And they had to get IBM. IBM actually tried to compete with Windows with a thing called OS/2, which was a very sophisticated operating system, but it wasn't developed against what people really wanted or needed. So Windows became dominant, and then Microsoft did the Office suite. So all of this built up over time to catch the wave. But when the internet showed up, Microsoft fumbled. Even though Bill Gates wrote a thing about how, legacy companies can't make transitions, and that the internet was the biggest challenge that Microsoft had ever faced. You can Google that and kind of read the thing. It was a remarkable thing. He knew that the problem existed but couldn't solve it. And I think that's part of the reason he ended up deciding to retire and go be a philanthropist, which took a while.
Because it was such a large emotional hit. So this is really interesting.
I think he had enough self-awareness to know that he couldn't quite figure this thing out. So he wanted to turn the company over.
It's really interesting territory because it gets into the problem I have with a lot of people in San Francisco, particularly the technologists, is the rationality. We've discussed it a few times of how none of this, particularly in the startup stuff, is rational. But you just gave me an example of a big company also not being rational.
Oh, well, that happened to IBM, right? IBM had one business where they were incredibly powerful. And they handed the keys to the kingdom to Microsoft because they had no idea what they were getting into. And the company at large took a long time. They've actually done a really smart acquisition recently that's made their stock go up. And it's like, okay, but they're still only worth $80 billion or something like that, 200 billion. I don't know what it is, but it's a fraction of what Microsoft is worth. So anyway, it's not rational, but it is rational. It's rational. You have to get everything together all at the same time, everything everywhere all at once. So that transition between Gates and Nadella with Ballmer in the middle was when Microsoft just went sideways. They couldn't really figure out what to do, and then give total credit to Satya Nadella. And the same thing happened with at IBM. I mean, companies go through these changes, and if they don't figure it out, then they just kind of fade. But let's get back to how you get to that. Where did we start?
Well, yeah, no, we started at publishers, and I have a question that I've wanted to ask since we've talked. We were talking about technology companies adapting to larger waves, but the way we got onto it was a non-technology publishing house not knowing how to deal with the internet.
I'll broaden that. That to all media companies. If your job is to produce content and sell content to people, there's no technology involved in that. It's a creative exercise, and how you organize it as a company is different than how you organize a product company or even a service company. Media companies exist differently. So if you're in movies and TV, or if you're in news or book publishing or anything like that, none of them figured out how to deal with the internet. All of the companies that really came out with interesting new approaches to media were startups. Yeah, like Netflix. Netflix is now considered a monopoly almost because they control so much of content
Mm,
production delivery.
mm,
The so
mm.
now the reason for that is that in the media business are small, right? So even though Time Magazine was like $1 billion operation in terms of its advertising and subscription sales, um, they were a small part of the overall Time Inc. And when you produce movies where you can't really predict what's going to happen after you've spent all the money or most of the money, or I mean, every media company, every media business, including video games, which are entirely technology based, is terrible at centralizing and managing their corporate resources. Um, so that's just the way media companies are. So they were really unprepared for the internet and for the mobile phone. I mean, at every stage, this is why we're starting a new fund that's focused on this because we think we know what's going to happen. Um, and the media companies still are clueless. Every time that there's a major shift in technology, it takes them a long time to figure out how to assimilate it.
So, how did it, how, specifically, anecdotes, details, how did it specifically suck? How did knowledge management at Fortune suck? And how was
Was
that?
Well, there was
What's
knowledge
up?
management at Fortune itself, but they had a photo archive, they had their manuscript archive, they managed their own, but it was all contained up in your head because, how long had the editor been there and what was the theory behind how they wrote articles? And Fortune went through multiple transitions since it was started in 1932, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, there were multiple fortunes along the way, and every time there was a new fortune, they try to figure out, well, what made Fortune previously successful, and how do we adapt that? So that when I was writing, I was the first columnist for Fortune when I became a columnist in '96, um, because the previous regime at Fortune had said columns don't have any value. They didn't have columnists. They just wrote articles and had great writers, and they reputation was they had this great uh, the stable of great writers who would write about business that was writerly, um, and
Wait,
you'd enjoy reading the articles.
what is the difference between a columnist and a writer?
Columnist writes a periodic thing that's I don't know, God, writer you're told what to do. A columnist, in fact that
Oh,
was the
it's
first
like a
experience.
contractor.
Oh yeah, I was a contractor.
Oh.
Very first column for Fortune, just to give you an idea, I put the headline, Netscape is dead meat. And you can go Google it and you can find it actually.
Did Mark Andreessen comment?
Uh, no, by that time, it didn't really matter. Um, just by then, uh, uh, that's orthogonal. Let me finish what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah.
So I wrote this column and I submitted it to my editor. Um, uh, and a fellow named Rick Tetzelli. And Rick did what they always do, it's they submitted it to legal. So the first call I got was from the lawyer at Time Inc., who said, how can you um, say that? What are your sources? And because that's what reporting was. You couldn't say anything yourself. You're a reporter. You have to go find someone else to say it to construct the story and establish the value of it. And my response was, that's a really strange question for you to ask because I am the expert. That's why Fortune hired me to write a column. So I'm making the statement because this is what I know. I don't ask someone else to tell me what to think. I'm not a reporter. I'm an opinion writer. And she was like, well, we'll have to see about that. Um, and so I sent, did I have email at that time? Yes. I sent an email to Rick Tetzelli and said, so Rick, got a call from the lawyer. What are you going to do about this? And they published it the way I wrote it. I mean, he edited the column and we had the interaction about that, but they kept my headline. And that was a new experience for Fortune at that time in 1996, because this is a new editor, a fellow named Norm Pearlstein, um, who had taken over from the old editor who set it up one way, and he was doing everything. And so the lawyer who was centralized at Time Inc. was just operating off the previous thing, and they had to rejigger the whole thing in order to get Norm's approach. And they had more columnists later, and I was sort of the first one because their tech coverage is terrible, and they really didn't understand what was going on. Brent,
Mm.
the guy that introduced me there, he had become sort of the Silicon Valley editor
Oh.
for Fortune. But I
Okay,
already knew him.
there's a whole bunch of here, particularly in relation to the book, that I want to drill in. But it's really interesting to know that writers were the main juice of the media publishing industry, and then it switched to contractors, and I'm sure that that just continued.
No, there's not a switch. Don't think of it that way. There were full-time employees and there were contractors.
But slowly over time, didn't it lean
Employees
more
and
towards
contractors.
contractors?
My father was a contractor for
Oh.
Newsweek. Actually, he did that by choice because they tried to hire him as a full-time employee, and he said, "No, I don't want to be your employee. Pay me as a contractor."
But this is a bit of a tangent, but in the late 2000s, once the second convergence was fully in there, didn't most of them become contractors? Do publications like, does the Washington Post right now have they probably have a full staff of writers and
It's a daily newspaper. That's, well, what we used to refer to as a daily newspaper. It's really a news service now because daily doesn't matter anymore. That was a cycle for printing the newspaper.
It's everywhere all at once, all the time.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we're talking about me at Infowell, when the internet showed up, we had to try to persuade our reporters that publishing an issue wasn't the issue anymore because we could publish instantly. So you had to think differently about reporting a story. You couldn't wait for the deadline for the print. You had to deal with it
That's
right
why there are
away. That was
deadlines.
huge.
That's why there are deadlines, is because there's a print schedule and that the printing
Yeah.
press
And you
has a
had to,
deadline.
on
Whoa.
Friday or Thursday night, we had to put everything to bed, and Friday we shipped it to the printer, and it would be printed over the weekend and delivered to the user on Monday.
There's an
That's a week.
anecdote. There's an anecdote about deadlines, because I remember you would always complain about deadlines, or you would always.
No, I don't complain about it. My life has been driven by deadlines. If I
That's what you
don't
said.
have
Yeah.
a deadline, I can't do anything. I'm like
Yeah.
useless. Which is a problem when you're doing your own thing because you set your own deadlines and you go like, oh, well, I can do it.
And this is the whole issue of the second convergence, because it is everywhere all at once.
By the time of the second convergence with social media and the cloud and all of this highly distributed high-speed network, there was really no reason to print. And so you go, okay, the New York Times still prints every day. I don't even know if the Washington Post does, but what's the point, right? The Santa Fe, New Mexican prints every day. But I can buy a digital subscription. I don't even need to get it. So what percentage of subscribers to a daily newspaper actually read the print? And one thing you'd say is it's probably somebody that's been subscribing for more than 10 years.
Uh-huh.
Subscribing. They're probably over 50, maybe over 60. And they prefer the same thing happens with books. I read all my books on Kindle on my phone. I hope my sister never hears this, but so if it's all digital, but there's no reason to print unless there is a reason to print. And so we have this magazine in Santa Fe called Santa Fe Magazine, which is beautiful and it's big. And this is an experienced guy who moved here, who'd worked in magazines before, and he figured out there's no reason to print a Santa Fe magazine unless you make it beautiful and you have great ads and you have these
Oh,
great
that's nice.
graphics.
I like that.
It's a tabletop, coffee table magazine, but it actually provides you a lot of information about Santa Fe perspective.
Okay. I've got a question, because it's all related to everything we're talking about. I want to get back to the anecdotes of the specific 96 to 2000, but before we go into that, we're talking about the fact that in that era, 96 to 2000, it feels like the biggest loss of information since the fall of the Roman Empire. Like, it feels like that's the level of degree of how hard it is to find information specifically as we need to. Like, it feels that bad. Like, that's the amount of information that we lost.
there's two things going on. One is, and this is true for me, I'm of an age where almost everything I wrote professionally, we can't find it on the internet.
Yeah.
Um, but there's a permanent record, and I have it, right? I have a copy of everything I've ever written.
Yeah.
Um, and in the case of my father, who died in 74, the internet wasn't even in anybody's head,
Yeah.
right? So everything since the Roman Empire is recorded by being written down or printed or physically present, including letters. And this is a really interesting part of it. Since everything gets digitized, the instance of physically recording that uh, has disappeared. So you can't find stuff now unless it was written while the internet was on, and particularly later when the internet became more permanent. I mean, you went to the
But it's
Internet
not
Archive.
permanent still. Facebook is still sending me messages that I'm about to get all of my stuff deleted in 30 days.
Yeah,
And it's going away. It's like there's no record of that. It's all going
yeah.
away because Facebook has a profit margin, and I know it's
They don't
so
want to store that stuff.
yeah, yeah,
You went to the Internet Archive while you were in San Francisco, and
yeah.
you saw what their attempt to record everything and make sure there is a version of it.
But that's
It's
not letters.
still only a fraction. Yeah,
Yeah,
this
it's
is
not
not.
letters. Yeah.
So the history. This is actually. I mean, here we're talking because part what we're doing is recording this, and I figured out this thing of, well, you can extract my own anecdotes out of this for my book. Well, when I think about what do I know, I'm 73. What do I remember? I'm going like, wow, there's a lot of detail I've lost in here, and how do I go back? And so as I was mentioning before we got on, Bill Gates wrote a book about it. The first sort of from him being born to starting Microsoft, but only starting it. And he obviously had to go back because he's 3 years younger than I am. He had to go back and talk to people about what happened back then so that he wasn't just kind of making it up. Um, and maybe I'm going to have to put some effort into this to beyond what I can just remember.
Well, and it's a problem that I think about all the time. It's probably the problem that I think about the most because on my show Crazy Wisdom, I've now done 450 episodes, and there's so much, and I learned everything that they shared with me, but I don't remember it. And I've been aware of this problem for a long time. There's something called the exponential forgetting curve, and there's 90% of everything that we learn in this podcast episode is going to go away from both of our memories unless there's a strategic reminder on the fourth day. And so there's software that helps you remember things that I use. And so this is just like a very problem. And actually, let's bring this into the database, the Oracle database that you had mentioned. So what was Oracle's main innovation in terms of the blob? Because right now I have a blob of podcast episodes that are too large to put into one LLM. So I need to do something with them, and I'm going to build a vector arrays database in order to do that. But where did this whole thing start?
So if you go all the way back to uh, like IBM and the mainframe, um, data storage was actually not part of the original proposition. It was all about writing programs and executing them. And so there were no hard disks. Things weren't stored. And so at some point, somebody said, well, we could actually remember this stuff and store it. Like when they started doing the census, you had to,
yeah,
store the data so you could get at it later. Um, and in that case, it would be a file on a disk somewhere. And I might be misspeaking a little bit, but and there would be a pointer to that file. And then the software would have to figure out how to get it. This was not very efficient because you could create another file that was very similar to the first one and you couldn't tell the difference between them. And there was no absolute record of reliable data. So Oracle, the innovation that they introduced, and I think his name was Jay Miner, is the CTO. Larry Ellison always claimed this, but the CTO came up with the RDBMS. And I think it had been developed in academia, but this was the
yeah,
first commercial
yeah.
version of it. And RDBMS stands for Relational Database Management System, RDBAMS. And the thing it did was, and your Uncle Joe knows this in much more detail because he actually started a business based on this, programming for RDBMS. And so the thing they did was, see if I can remember the technical term, because technical terms always describe exactly what they did. What they did was that two-phase commit. That was the description of what they did was, say, store a piece of data, and then you would test it, and that's the second phase, so that once you locked it, that data didn't change. And that two-phase commit was core to the concept of a relational database management, the relation between pieces of data. And if you changed a piece of data, you had to test it before you could store it and replace the previous version. And I mean, it's a basic concept of, sort of conceptually how you store data and make sure that it's actually what it should be. And so that's the thing that Oracle did, was they provided a relational database management system, and companies adopted it because they needed to know for sure their data was real. And now, when you talk about vectorized data, that's a much newer concept. We have a company that's actually core to this, which we plan on making a lot of money on. And there are others. But vectorized data means in a very large set of data, because remember when RDBMS was introduced and adopted, the data was very small. Now we have things that are terabytes or what's next up? Quad bytes or whatever the hell it is.
Petabytes.
But petabytes, thanks. So now you have databases where there's, and this is the LLMs, it's a big deal, where trying to maintain all the relationships between the bits of data slows the whole process down. So in order to have really high performance databases with very small amounts of data, like Facebook's ability to publish to your feed something that's specific to you, but not to any of the other 3 billion people or whatever it is. That's a flat file database that's been vectorized. It's like whatever. So it's a huge technical innovation what Facebook did, as well as Twitter and the other social media companies, that they were able to maintain that level of data at that high performance across the internet. That's a vectorized database. Now, there's multiple levels of nuance to that, but the fundamental idea is that you have a huge amount of data and you can use kind of real-time processes to access that data.
So where does an index come in? Because so I had Claude build me, so I'm trying to build this vectorized database, and the funniest part about my life right now is that I'm in constant conversation with an alien intelligence that gives me part of what I need, but then also distracts me with giant rabbit holes that have no relevance whatsoever. And so I've got it to give me a quiz about databases so I can understand what I need to understand to tell it what to do. Now, it gave me the idea of an index where I've got one table and then I've got another table, and that's where you're talking about the relational databases, that those two things are related to each other. What does an index do, and who came up with that?
God, you could even get into I think what's called a hash table. In a program, for instance, you have data that the program uses to run itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's called a hash table. I'm not doing this quite correctly because I don't program myself. So when you have a database, when you have data on a computer in a disk drive, you have to have an index to where the data resides on the disk drive.
Yeah.
So that's its most elemental. So you need an index in order to know where the data is stored. But inside the database, you also need an index to keep track of the data. It's basically metadata.
Yeah. So,
And metadata is the concept of data about data.
wait, okay, yeah. Let's go into metadata. When did that term become important?
Good. Almost immediately, because uh, I mean, people who program databases knew what metadata was,
Yeah,
but that was like a very
yeah,
small group of people.
yeah,
So most people, you'd stop on the street and go, "So what's metadata?" They're going to go like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
yeah.
Um, but it's become more common to know what metadata is in the sense that if you have a photograph, for instance, you have information, you have the photograph, and then you have the information about the photograph. You have the resolution that it is, the date it was taken, the location it was taken, all that's all metadata. So that's really easy for people to understand that there's a photo and then metadata that's associated with the photo. But metadata is just generically information about data. And so you can, understand where that data came from and what it was.
So there,
And an
there's
index is
yeah.
not metadata. Index is kind of an index to the metadata.
So there's a library.
You're pushing me here because I'm right on the edge of my own understanding.
Well, it's good because it's giving me a whole bunch of follow-up things to do about. Um, and part of me wants to continue down that track. It was really funny when I just looked up on Perplexity, when did metadata become important? It took me back all the way to the Great Library of Alexandria, used tags on scrolls to provide title, subject, and author information. But then it brings up Adobe in 1994, and but which makes me realize that we haven't talked about Adobe at all. We don't need to do that now because I want to save the last 10 or 15 minutes to go into what 1996. Actually, let's go 19 when the web came out because that's chapter 7. Um, we were talking about you finding the web, you finding Mosaic. Let's go into Netscape. Anecdotes about Netscape. Um, what is the most just exciting or ridiculous thing that happened in relation to Netscape that you remember that you were involved with?
Um, that Kleiner Perkins invested in them. Um, so Mosaic was developed while Mark Andreessen was at school
Yeah,
at
yeah.
University of Illinois, Ohio, something like that. Anyway, in the Midwest. Um, and so he was a member of the team that developed it. And there was no concept of open source at the time, but it was academic. And so there was no commercial sense of it, right? That you would buy it or spend money in it or anything like
Uh-huh.
that. It was just
Uh-huh.
sort of browsing information um, with a bunch of other protocols underneath it. But Kleiner Perkins picked it up right away. This is John Doerr's magic. um, and he recruited Mark Andreessen to come to Silicon Valley. And then they established the company Netscape. That's why Mark is the founder of Netscape and commercialized Mosaic. Right? So they took all the code from Mosaic. Maybe they had to rewrite it. I don't know exactly what it was. And they
Oh.
introduced Netscape. So Netscape was the first sort of commercially supported browser. Um, but it was still free. They didn't charge for it. And there wasn't really an economic, I mean, when Google started, they had no economic proposition either. Having a business model is not necessarily the starting point for a new company. Um, but it was proprietary. Netscape owned the code. And um, they were trying to figure out a business model for it. And, and so the fact that Kleiner Perkins funded it is, I mean, when you ask me that question, it's kind of the most exciting part because
So
it's like, no, this isn't
how did
just an academic program. Now it's like,
yeah, it's
oh, this.
commercialization of technology waves, which is a very clear part of your story. Did you? What is your relationship to John Doerr? When did you first meet him, and how does he involve in your story?
Goes way back.
Uh-huh.
Uh, John, well, there's a part before this, but the really significant thing is I got to know John well enough as a reporter that when I was fired by Infowald in 1981 and started, no, 84, and started my newsletter January of 1985, he was one of my investors. He wrote a check for, try to remember how much it was, but I raised $60,000. So my brother was an investor. My mother was an investor. John Doerr was an investor, and there are a couple of others. And he did that kind of thing. Like he wasn't going to make a lot of money off of investing in my
Yeah, not
newsletter, but
rational. Not
yeah,
rational.
he
Yeah.
said like this is a talented guy. I'll support him. I'll write a check. Um, and so it was a small check, um, and then it was successful, and I sold it. And the reason I sold it was so I could pay off my investors, including my mother, my brother, and John Doerr. And Mansour is another one. And anyway, so um, and
Mansour,
I
wait,
did.
wait. Who? I didn't get that part. Who's Mansour?
Uh, Mansour Zakaria. His brother is Fareed Zakaria. He's very well known as a economist. Has a Substack. Um, the uh, I just had gotten to know Mansour at the time, and he wrote a check for, I think he might have been $5,000 or $10,000. But anyway, all added up to $63,000 was the total. And um, one of my proudest accomplishments. I started a business, raised a little bit of money, paid it back. Everybody was happy,
Uh,
uh, and I built a successful business. The uh, so that's how I got to know John. Now, John was already at Kleiner Perkins, and before Netscape, he'd done a bunch of deals, and no, that was later. He actually start funded a company to build a laptop computer
whoa.
before Compaq. It was no, it was after Compaq, but it was, try to build a real notebook computer like the one that I'm looking at now. And the it failed. The company failed. So John lost money on a bunch of different occasions. John was also the guy that invested in Gilman's
Mm.
company, as ultimately known as Spectrum Holobyte. And
This is before Incutel.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, well,
Spectrum Hallback.
Holobyte,
Holobyte.
Holbyte. It's not actually the original name of the company, but they merged with a company called Spectrum Holobyte. And there is a whole history because anyway, so I won't tell you Gilman's history right now because that would be distracting. But
So
just got
John
it.
Doerr invested in your company because he knew you as a writer. You started a company. He invested in the company, and there's some clarity in terms of the demo, where demo and agenda fits into that. But then afterwards, what happened in the browser era in your relationship?
After that, it was like he invested, made money. The reason I sold the company was to start Agenda. So
Okay.
I didn't need to sell the company to do that, but I did. Didn't know that at the time. And then IDG owned the company that I'd started after they fired me. And then we started the conferences, Agenda and then Demo a few years later. We actually started the third conference. It didn't work,
Got it.
but
Got it. Did John Doerr ever come to Agenda or?
oh yeah,
Yeah.
every year, every time.
Okay.
And so did Bill Gates. And in fact, one of the little anecdotes is I moved the conference, which was being held at the Ritz-Carlton in Laguna Niguel in late September, to a bigger hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Mm,
Failed to consider what the temperature would be in Scottsdale, Arizona. So first one we held there in late September was incredibly hot. So then we moved it to late October, and I always had Bill do the closing session, fireside chat, which was SRO, standing room only. People would try to get into the conference to hear this. And when I moved it from September to October, I moved it to a date when he had a commitment to be in China to talk to the premier of China. This is pre Xi Jinping and whoever the hell was running China back then. And so he couldn't change his schedule. So I turned first to Steve Jobs and he said no. And then I turned to John Doerr and said,
oh, that's right.
that fireside chat we have at the end of the conference, how'd you like to be my chatter? And so I did it with John Doerr.
Okay,
So,
that's great.
I'd ask him things and he'd always be there for me. And that's who he was. That's who he is. I ran into him at the conference. Were you there when I ran into him? He was at that AI conference.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
um, so okay, and then so he's just a nice guy handing out money to interesting people.
Not handed out. I mean,
No,
like
I get
I'm an
it. Yeah, yeah, it was a joke. But and then Google. Then he ends up at Google.
not ends up in Google. He was the investor in Google.
Yeah.
You're talking about John Doerr. Are you talking about Mark Andreessen or are you talking about John
No,
Doerr?
no, I'm talking about John Doerr, and I'm trying to figure out what happened in between '96 and 2000 with John Doerr.
So 99 is when he invested in Google.
Yep.
The first deal he did before Netscape was Sun Microsystems. He invested
Okay.
in Sun, which
Interesting.
was $1 million company at one point. And he did other ones before that, but Sun was the first one that made his rep. Um, and so there's a longer history with John before, I started my newsletter. And then he invested in Google. Um, he invested in Amazon in 97, invested in Google in 99.
Wow.
He was right on top, right? Sun Microsystems actually showed him the way because Sun was the servers that ran companies' intranets. And that became a multi-billion-dollar company because they were the workstations and servers. And he saw what was happening. And Sun is an acronym for Stanford University Network. So Sun
That's how I
Microsystems
found
was
Google. Yep.
developed at Stanford
Yep.
on the internet at Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
I think Google was too. And so, I mean, he was right in there. So Amazon was actually orthogonal to that whole thing because Bezos was up in Seattle and, wasn't part of it.
Okay.
So John has an amazing track record. And so I'll tell this anecdote. I don't know that it's true. I might have made it up, but I'm pretty sure it is. They invest in Kleiner Perkins 9, Fund 9. They invested in 32 companies. Um, they didn't make money on any of the other 31, but the 32nd was Google. And they made so much money on Google that that's one of the best funds in the history of venture capital,
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
which is how the venture capital business kind of works. But
Okay. So last question: where does Mark Andreessen fit into the what happened after they released Netscape?
so Netscape was a successful company. They recruited a guy to be CEO of it, a guy named Jim Barksdale. Um, uh, um, the dog is barking, so I'm trying
I
to
can
get
hear
my
it.
shit. Yeah, I know you can't hear it, but I can. Um, and so, he was chief technology officer at Netscape. We actually sold a company to Netscape too. Portola Communications, one of my first wins. Um, and uh, and that was when Netscape was transitioning. And so Mark left Netscape. They merged, Kleiner, who were invested in both companies, merged Netscape with another company. I won't remember it right now. And that merged company is one that bought my Portco.
Mm.
The So eventually, Mark Andreessen, so they merged the companies and they went public. And uh, Mark left. I can't remember exactly how that happened, and started a company to do enterprise software, which ultimately was successful. So Mark made money at Netscape. He made money at no, not OpenWave. That's a different one, but you'd have to look it up. It
I'm
started with an
looking it
O.
up right now.
Yeah. And that company went through very, very difficult times and almost went out of business. But somehow they figured out how to make it work and was sold to somebody like HP or something and made enough money that between the money he made at Netscape and the money that he made at that company, Mark had enough money to live his life, whatever. So he just started to start Andreessen Horowitz. And with his prototypical aggressive, I'm going to change the venture capital business. I'm
Uh,
going to run the venture capital business, which in hindsight, he actually has.
yeah.
Because Andreessen Horowitz said a whole different thing where they did, invested in company, they do your marketing for
Yeah.
you. They do
Okay. Yeah.
personnel. They do your, it's a whole system, completely different than previous venture capital, which a number of other firms have adopted. Some haven't. Kleiner Perkins actually has not adopted it, ironically. Um, so, so that covers about, I think, for Mark, about 20 years, like from 94 doing Mosaic to when he started Andreessen Horowitz.
Yeah. Okay. So I got the list here. So Netscape merged with AOL that finalized in March 1999. Merger involved a three-way arrangement where AOL acquired Netscape for approximately 4.2 billion, while Sun Microsystems took over Netscape's server software division, which makes an interesting point.
Which included the company that we sold to him.
Okay, got it.
That was the email system that Netscape had developed and then Sun bought, plus a bunch of other stuff. Because they tried to make Netscape an enterprise company, and it kind of didn't really work that well. So Sun bought it, and they didn't really work for them either. But that's Kleiner sitting in the middle of all three deals. They funded AOL, funded
Man, such interesting story. There's something there about the future of AI that we can go into next time. Just how it's the serendipitous nature of everything, and how all these characters play roles in one part and then come back later. But it's a really small group of people, and relatively
The
small.
HP dimension, which I'll do as a tease, my concentric circle theory of success.
Okay, we'll do that next time. I may have AI draw up the concentric circle as we talk. So thank you so much. See you next week.
Yeah.